This is a very good point about legitimacy and consent. In a democracy, we can measure legitimacy, okay? I've just shown you how to do so. It's not the only way. I think you should give some thought to what are the other indicators beyond what we could discern in public opinion polls. And since this then bears on the issue of consolidation, I'll let you talk about it in the sections tomorrow and Thursday. But in a democracy, we can ask people what they think. They can reply without fear that Big Brother is listening on the telephone and they could wind up in jail if they give the wrong answer, which I will say parenthetically is why I'm a little suspicious of the results we get from some of our public opinion surveys, like the Asian Barometer, where we've asked some of these questions in China and Vietnam, both of which are communist countries, and we get extremely high levels of belief in the legitimacy of communist rule. Okay, maybe that's the case, because first of all, they've been performing at extremely high rates of economic growth. Second of all, they've got, now I will use the word very intentionally, great propaganda systems and are extremely energetic and resourceful, and in the case of China, I would say technologically sophisticated and politically obsessed at preempting and censoring any other expression of sentiment or infiltration of ideas that conflict with the Communist Party line about the legitimacy of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party rule. So maybe that's the reality, or maybe there's some percent of respondents, could be 5%, could be 40%. I don't think it's all of them, who are not going to give a critical answer about Communist Party rule because they don't trust that they won't suffer consequences if they say what they really think. Now, this creates a larger problem in authoritarian systems in terms of assessing political legitimacy. If you see compliance all over the place, one of the things that distinguishes China, North Korea, Vietnam, Iraq under Saddam Hussein is that there are very low levels of crime. There's a lot of corruption, but in terms of violent crime, it's relatively small. And there's relatively, well, in China now, there's a lot of small-scale protests. In North Korea, very little. When you see little crime, little protest, basically the overwhelming dominant social and political behavior is voluntary compliance, there are two conclusions you can draw from it. One is the regime, maybe it's manufactured it through ideological indoctrination, but nevertheless, the regime is very legitimate. People believe it's got a moral title to rule. The second one is that people are living in fear, and they're not going to stick their neck out so that they can be sent to the North Korean gulag, even for, because this happens if you read about North Korea, even for, suggesting that Kim Jong-un may not be a godlike figure and that perhaps people should question some of what he does. So it's much harder to know whether there's real consent, real compliance, real legitimacy in an authoritarian regime, because you can't measure it, and the visible demonstrations of it may be insincere behavior that is in fact the result of a climate of fear and coercion. What we know is, in a number of communist systems, once the lid of fear and intimidation and coercion was lifted, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, in 1988 and 89, what did you see? You saw massive numbers of people coming out to the streets to protest, people fleeing out of Hungary and then East Germany as soon as they felt they could do so without coercive retaliation, and then the whole system unraveling very rapidly. So it's really hard to know what people's preferences are in an authoritarian regime. And the more authoritarian the regime, the more difficult it is to truly know. We're trying to get at it in public opinion survey research when we are allowed to ask the questions by the censoring authorities, but there are methodological problems. Any other questions about this before I move on? Okay, so why is democracy so much in need of legitimacy? It's a system of institutionalized conflict, okay? Competition for power. So this is kind of the other answer here. And if you don't have a belief in the legitimacy of democracy, and you've got all these people competing for power in elections, then it's going to be very hard to get them to play by the rules of the democratic game. And they're going to be much more inclined to defect from those rules, use corruption, electoral fraud, violence as a means of trying to obtain power. When people believe intrinsically in the moral worth and authority of democracy, they're also more likely to comply with its rules. Yeah. Well, the cost of not having rigorous methods for measuring legitimacy in authoritarian regimes is imperfect information and possibly a false picture of legitimacy and a lot of guesswork. And by the way, it could be in either direction. It could be that our assumptions that this is all specious and superficial, and that beneath the superficial climate of compliance, there's broad resentment against the regime. There's also the danger that hopeful assumption could be wrong. And the regime really does have a broad base of support. So it's just very hard to know, and that's why it's useful, even if you're allowed to do public opinion research in an authoritarian regime, you've got to look to other methods. And I just ask you to think about what are the other behavioral indicators that could indicate legitimacy or questioning and resentment. Obviously, if you're seeing a lot of social media posting questioning the authority of the regime, then that's a direct indicator, but it's in the nature of authoritarian regimes, and increasingly with their technology to censor that, jump all over it, and suppress it very quickly. There are a lot of small-scale protests in the People's Republic of China on a really daily basis, but there's a debate among China scholars as to whether those are simply localized protests of resentment against localized authorities without questioning the moral right to rule of the Chinese Communist Party at the political center for the whole country, or whether it's symptomatic of more deeper questioning about the whole system. And frankly, we just don't know. It's one of the biggest debates in China's studies today.